Okay, for this video we're going to keep it pretty straightforward. So I was thinking we could create a multi-layered sort of evolving sound in a way that really just takes advantage of the subtractive synthesis capabilities of Operator. And of course in other videos we'll get into the FM capabilities. So as for the actual sound that I want to create, I want something that's going to be played in the higher registers mostly, although still remaining flexible enough to play lower on the keyboard. I want it to kind of have the character of birds chirping, mixed with bell-like timbres as well. So let's see what we can put together here. As you can see here, I have the algorithm view selected in Operator, and of course Operator defaults to this standard algorithm where all of the operators are affecting one another in a sequence. So D is affecting C, is affecting B, is affecting A, and then A is the only audible one. Well, I'm going to come over here to an even simpler algorithm for now, where none of the oscillators are affected by any other oscillator, and instead they're all audible and mixing together, as they would in a regular subtractive synthesizer. So let's begin putting together this sound. I'll just deactivate these other oscillators for the sake of clarity, so we're just dealing with this one audible oscillator to start off with. Now I'm thinking I want to go for a sound that kind of emphasizes the high end of the frequency spectrum more for now, so I'm actually going to play an octave or two up on the keyboard here. Now for this particular oscillator, I want to go into using user-defined waveforms. As you remember from the introductory video, you have a bunch of these default waveforms that you can use for your oscillator shape. However, I'm going to scroll down here and choose the user waveform, and as you remember, you're presented here with a series of harmonics that you can manipulate. As you can see, we just have a pure sine wave tone going right now, and the harmonic readout corresponds with that, because a sine wave is just one fundamental frequency with absolutely no harmonic overtones. Indeed, you can see here that you have the fundamental frequency here at full volume, and nothing else happening higher in the harmonic spectrum. Now in the spirit of straightforwardness, I'm going to increase the coarseness of the frequencies that were shown here, so that we only have 16 divisions to deal with. So I'll keep the fundamental frequency up a bit. And then I'll also bring up some of these overtones. And as you can see here, there's a little preview of the wave shape updating, depending on how you manipulate the harmonics up here. So as you can see, it's fairly easy to develop your own little timbre here, just by bringing the volumes of each of these harmonics up and down relative to one another. When they add together, they create a little single cycle waveform that repeats over and over again. I'm actually going to bring this harmonic up just a bit more. And this sound will form the basis around which the other oscillators and sounds will sit. So now that we have this basic tone here, let's go over and define its envelope. As you can see, the oscillator section's here. You just come over and click in this box, and you get the envelope view. I'm actually just going to reduce the decay time just a bit here, so that we have a very subtle roll-off from the attack phase into the sustain. And I'm also going to bring out this release time. Now since we're treating this like subtractive synthesis, I'm actually going to move over to the filter now to shape this tone a little bit more. So first I'll activate the filter. And I'm going to set this to a bandpass filter, which if you remember is a kind of filter that only lets a certain frequency band through, and everything below and above that frequency band are rejected. So I'll just tweak this a little bit. Now I'll change the filter envelope here. I'm going to make it actually fade in over time. You won't be able to hear it yet because I haven't assigned the envelope yet. And now I'll actually bring the assignment of the envelope to -100%. And you can hear that the filter change had a very dramatic effect on the sound, because now the frequency is moving down over this attack phase, remember, because the envelope is assigned at -100%, and then staying in that low position over this period, and then when I release the key, the filter opens back up. Now of course you could reverse these two things and have exactly the same sound. I could just bring assignment up to 100% instead of -100%, and then start the filter up here, and basically reverse this whole shape, rotated around the x-axis, if you like to think about it that way. So now let's move on to mixing in two other oscillators to add some further animation to this sound. So let's move on to Operator B. I'll enable it. I'll bring the level up a bit. And it's tuned, of course, an octave up from our main oscillator down here. So it's adding a very pleasant tonal characteristic. I'll come over here to the wave, chooser section, and I think I want more of a square wave mixed in with my customized waveform down here. For now, I'll choose square D. Now I'll come over here to the envelope and we'll manipulate it to fade in a little bit after this first oscillator. So if I want this sound to slowly become audible, hitting its peak after oscillator A down here, of course I'll want to manipulate the attack time. And as I manipulate the attack time, I'll also want to bring the level up. And you can hear it slowly fading in, just very subtly there. I'll bring this attack down a little bit, maybe to 600 milliseconds or so. And if I come back over here and play around with the frequency a bit, you can see how drastically Oscillator B has changed the sound. So frequency would be a good candidate to assign, for instance, to a macro knob in order to drastically change up the sound in a performance context. Because as you bring the frequency up, you're starting to hear oscillators beyond just oscillator A. So in other words, you're adding more components to the sound just by twisting one knob right here. Let's add one more oscillator to the mix here. I'll just turn on C. Now I think I want more happening at the beginning of my sound, so I'm going to leave the attack phase of this oscillator alone, but I'll also tune it up to match the tuning of Oscillator B, which fades in a little bit over time. So in this way it creates kind of a call and response, because both oscillators are triggering at the same pitch, but one of them takes a little bit of time to fade in. I think I'm going to change the wave shape of this oscillator to be more audible. Let's try Saw 64 here. So the patch we've put together so far is relatively simple, but it's a good practical introduction to the features of Operator. We have 3 oscillators enabled, each of which are tuned differently. And also we have an interesting filter envelope going that provides a bit of sparkle on the release phase. I think I'll bring the release of the first oscillator up just a little bit, so I'll go back to its envelope section. And that further emphasizes that sparkle that the filter envelope is adding right here. The next thing I want to do is add a bit of pitch enveloping to this sound. Now the reason I'm doing this is because since we have our filter set up as a bandpass here, and it's focusing at a specific frequency, which I more or less arbitrarily chose because it sounded good at the time. We're here at 2.17 kilohertz. If I set up some pitch change down here using the pitch envelope, this will make it so that depending on where you are on the keyboard, you might get some drastically different timbres, which in turn depends on whether the pitches you're triggering correspond with the frequency range that I have defined up here. You can add further animation over a larger span of the keyboard by assigning some kind of modulation to the frequency itself. There are a variety of ways that you could do this, the most straightforward of which is to simply select the filter section here and then turn up your frequency to key tracking section to whatever percentage you want. What this will allow you to do is actually change the filter frequency depending on the MIDI note that you're inputting. And it's a very helpful feature, especially if you have other types of modulation going on, which respond in an animated way depending on what pitch is being triggered. So that's just an idea for you to implement on your own if you decide to add further animation to this little patch. So I'll come back down here to the pitch envelope, and right now you can see that it's not assigned at all to the sound. So regardless of what I have set up here, you're not going to hear any pitch change over time. Now as you remember from the introductory video to Operator, you can actually choose which destinations the pitch envelope is going to. And I'm going to take advantage of this feature and turn off the assignment of the pitch envelope to the LFO rate for now, because in a couple minutes we're going to add some LFO modulation to the attack phase of this sound that I don't want the pitch envelope interfering with. So now the pitch envelope is assigned to all 4 oscillators, although its assignment to D doesn't really matter either, because we don't have Oscillator D enabled at the moment, but we will leave it enabled for these 3 oscillators that we're currently using. And also for simplicity's sake, I'm going to leave this envelope at its default settings. I'm just going to focus on assigning the pitch envelope right here. And not only that, I'm going to assign it in a negative amount so that the pitch actually starts low and jumps up. So here it is without the pitch envelope. It's just got that filtering effect on the attack phase. And then I turn pitch envelope back on. And now we've added even more definition to the attack phase of the sound. Right now would be a good time to check this over multiple octaves, so I'm going to bring my computer keyboard down a couple octaves. And I'll bring it up. Now let's just add a few finishing touches to this basic patch and we'll be done. First I'm going to add some LFO to the attack phase of the sound in order to add some shimmer. Then I'll come down here, manipulate the time parameter in order to uniformly change the length of all of the envelopes in operator. And last I'll put a little bit of reverb on the end of this sound to emphasize that sparkly tail. So I'll come back here, I'll enable my LFO. So first I'm just going to deassign it from D, again because we don't need that. Now of course that deassignment's not really having any effect on the CPU usage of the instrument. I just like to do that to keep my interface clean. So now that I have the LFO activated, let's see what the effect is by default. And predictably it's changing the pitches of these 3 oscillators at a rate of 64. So the first thing I'm going to do is choose this new waveform, saw wave down, which is aptly named because it's actually bringing the pitch down after a short attack period. I'm going to leave retrig on so that the LFO restarts its phase back to the beginning of the waveform every time I trigger a key. Now since I want to add a shimmering effect to the beginning of the sound, I really think that a higher LFO rate would be appropriate in order to match that idea. And I'm also going to assign it a bit more. Now my next concern is that I don't want this LFO to have its effect throughout the entire time that I'm holding down the key. Like I said before, I only want it to affect the attack phase of the sound. And the nice thing about the LFO and operator is that it's actually got its own envelope. So I can easily get the effect that I want right here. And there we go, with just a little bit of reduction in the decay and sustain periods, I brought it down from this to this. The last thing I want to do on the operator instrument itself is adjust the time parameter. The time parameter is nice because it adjusts all of the envelopes in operator, whether they be the oscillator envelopes, the LFO envelope, whatever, uniformly. And as you can hear, that's a nice way to drastically change the entire tone of the patch with just one knob. You could think of this as a built-in macro knob in operator because it's affecting all of those envelopes at the same time. The last thing I'll do is add a little bit of reverb to this sound, and then we'll test it out over multiple octaves again before we finish. So I'll drag a reverb onto the track right here. So I want to bring this dry wet down to have less of the reverb sound. And I'll also change the quality from economical to high. So the reverb isn't drowning out the sound, but it is providing a little bit of an emphasis to that shimmering release phase. So the last thing I'll do is just demo this over a few different octaves, and you can see what different effects you get depending on the tuning of the notes that you input. Now one thing you might notice here is that all the low frequencies are getting reverberated as well. So I'm going to engage the low cut filter on the reverb here, which is a nice way to reject all of those low frequencies from ever having the reverb applied to them, so they'll remain dry. So now only the high frequencies, including a very gentle roll-off towards the very top of the spectrum, will be affected. So that about does it for this sound. It was a pretty basic patch considering we didn't use any FM synthesis, and instead we stuck with basic subtractive principles. We started off choosing the algorithm, that is this basic 4-oscillator algorithm, where none of them are actually affecting one another in a way that would make this FM synthesis. We simply went through oscillator by oscillator, defining various envelopes so that each of them had their own unique effect. A and C start right away, whereas B actually fades in a little bit over 624 milliseconds. We also chose differing waveforms for each of these oscillators so that they would blend well together and create a variety of interesting harmonics with very little work. When you start to blend together too many waveforms that use the exact same shape, the sound can get a bit muddied if the tunings are too close to one another. So it pays to experiment with varying the shapes of all the waves that you're mixing together. Of particular interest is the waveform that we generated for oscillator A, which was actually our own customized shape. If you click over here on oscillator, you can see that we brought up our fundamental frequency, as well as some harmonic overtones, to add to the tonal character of this sound, without making it too atonal or textural. Arguably the most important element of this sound was the filter and its corresponding envelope over here. I assigned it at -100% so that it basically reversed the pattern of this shape right here. The filter frequency starts high, moves down over the sustained period here, and then comes back up to high again over the release phase. We added the LFO, which introduced a little bit of a shimmering effect to the attack phase of the sound, and we also added the pitch envelope for an additional little effect. Last, we manipulated the time parameter in order to extend out the length of all of the envelopes at once in operator. The very last thing we did was to add a little bit of reverb to the sound, taking special care to not introduce any low frequencies into the reverb itself, while adding a little bit of shimmer and decay to the already well-defined release period of the original sound. So if you take nothing else away from this video, there are two things that I'd like you to remember. First, we chose a relatively simple algorithm for operator here, not actually using any FM synthesis features, and yet we were still able to come up with a pretty unique sound. The second, and perhaps even more important thing, is that the way I went about building this sound was thinking about not only the individual sounds that would make up the resulting timbre, that is, the individual oscillators being modulated by everything over here, but also the fact that it pays off to think about things in terms of different phases of time, that is, the attack phase, the period where the sound fades in and makes its first impression, generally telling you whether it will be a drum or a tonal sound or something completely different, the sustain phase, which is the time that the note is playing out and evolving in whatever way you set it up, and the all-important release phase, which is the last impression the sound makes before it fades to silence. More often than not, I think new producers get overwhelmed by the idea of sound design because they aren't breaking things down into manageable components. However, if you sit down and define your sound in terms of how you want the different phases of time to come together and make the final product, as well as how you want the different timbres to mix together to create the final sound, you'll find that these easy-to-digest chunks of information come together and create something far more complex than you would have thought you were able to create in the first place.